I think it was just what was in the air at the time, because, you know, the civil rights movement was, you know, at least the dust was still settling from that. And then the Vietnam War, obviously, which was multiracial. And I think it was, to me, it was just the spirit in the young people saying, first and foremost, like, we have a voice and we need to use it. Now, I think a lot of the people who were alive at that time would say it was just about sex and drugs, and that we had been so sheltered in our middle class bubble, you know, by the traditions of our parents, that they just were acting out. And beyond the music, the hippie movement, I mean, it did a lot for culture, you know, like as far as what was after that accepted. But it wasn't like they turned over any new legislation, you know. I think they had a little bit to do with getting the war in Vietnam over, or a good amount. I mean, they definitely put pressure on the government at that point to stop that warfare. But I think there was also just a huge desire to act out, to get naked and to bone everybody around you and take a lot of drugs, you know, because that was not only, you know, was it a new form of music, but it was a new form of drug too, you know, like experimental drugs had never been, you know, hallucinogenics, all that had really not been anything up to that point. And I think we kind of all, you know, like, especially people who are intrigued by the hippie movement, we're always like, oh, you know, they were such powerful people that we all congregated together and you know, fought and picketed and all that, which is, we did, and it was great. But I think a lot of it was kind of what Coachella in the States is now. You know, it was just like, well, we're gonna go to the Capitol and strike because there's gonna be free drugs there. I mean, I fear that potentially might be a little bit of the reason that nobody really talks about. All that being said, at least they formed, and at least they showed, like, we have power in numbers, and that we are the younger generation of this country that can have a voice and you should fear, or at least worry about. But I think, to me, the overwhelming, not overwhelming, but I just think it's funny that a lot of people don't talk about that. Because for me, I think about nowadays, you know, I'm playing Coachella this year, and I've been to Coachella, and Coachella is not about the music. And nobody gives a shit about the music. It's all about just going and taking drugs, you know? Which is cool, you know, to each his own. But it's not like there's some, like, overwhelming social reason why people go to the desert, paint their face, and wear gloves with lights on them. You know, like, that's cool, but it's just recreation. They're not doing it for a specific purpose to counteract a culture or anything. I'm just really doing it because it's an excuse to go and take drugs and party and drink and, you know, have sex. And I'll be the first one to say it because I've been to the festival and I know what it's about. You know, it's not about, like, Mumford & Sons are playing this year? Oh my God, I gotta go because they're so groundbreaking. You know, like, I love Mumford & Sons, they're the shit, but I am really sorry to inform them that people didn't come to Coachella because of them. And people aren't coming to Coachella to see Alan Stone or Red Hot Chili Peppers. I mean, they're gonna go to the set, but in my opinion, everybody that I've talked to who has paid $300 to go to one of those weekends is because there's an overwhelming desire in my country for Molly, ecstasy, acid, LSD, MDMA, every fucking drug you can imagine, you know. All my friends are that way, you know. Like, not all of them. I mean, but the majority of people I see in that culture are like that, you know. And I think that the hippie movement, you know, when you say that, like, do you believe that the music was such a huge part? I think it was. I think it did act as a major role in the civil rights movement and in the Vietnam War. You know, there's Creedence Clearwater Revival and Crosby, Stills and Nash. You know, like the Beatles. Like a lot of that music really did inspire people to do more than just go and meet up and do drugs. But there's definitely an element of that that's not talked about, which is like, I mean, maybe not so much back then. I don't want to speak for all of them back then, but I know for now, like nowadays, why my generation of kids come together for a purpose, it's just about drugs. It's sad, because you feel like, I mean, when I play a festival, I feel like, does any of this matter? Is this background music? You know? Are you listening to anything I'm saying? Because you're so fucked up out of your gourd on, you know, gnarly ass drugs. Who knows, you know? I've never done those crazy drugs. I've done drugs, but not those kind of drugs. Two parallels of counterculture, the Black Panther parallel, the civil rights parallel, and then the white middle class want to grow your hair out and not, you know, and defy your parents sort of culture. I think both did some good. I think both did some negative too. You know, I mean, shit. Look at how many horrible addictions were brought because of the Vietnam War. You know, how many people came back from Vietnam addicted to heroin? You know, how many? I mean, and Vietnam, the Vietnam War and the pull of that, I think, was what brought the enormous problem with heroin in the 80s and 90s, you know, and especially the early 90s. You look at like the grunge scene and like the hair metal scene and all these, you know, Jimi Hendrix, and so many people died because of heroin back in those days. And, but yeah, there is a scope and a reason to think that, yeah, there was a parallel between the two of white people just having angst and the black people actually being oppressed, you know. But then again, you know, there's they may have been separated because throughout history they've all, like in our country, it was separated, and I think that may be the reason why. Black culture still to this day is so much different than white middle class culture. Like for me, like I grew up in the country, and my drummer and my keyboard player, they're both African American, and the way that they were raised and what makes sense to them in a lot of situations makes absolutely no sense to me. Like I'm the type of dude who I'll just walk around, I don't care, I'll meet anybody. And they're very guarded, or more guarded than me, because they grew up around violence, they grew up around gang violence and guns, and, you know, my drummer grew up in Washington, D.C., you know, the crime capital of the States. So, to me, I think it's just a difference in culture. You know, you don't see a lot of Asian Americans at Woodstock either. I think that it's not necessarily like racism, like the whites were keeping the darks out, or the yellows, or the whatever you want to call, however you want to dissect color groups. I think it was just completely different cultures, you know, because in reality, whites were getting drafted just as much as blacks were getting drafted, you know. If I was an 18-year-old, I had an uncle who died in the Vietnam War because he was drafted. And if I was his age, thinking about having that happen to me, going over and fighting a war that was completely worthless, like if I felt like I was going to have to be drafted to go over to Iraq and fight a bullshit war that seemingly has no end to it, and for no reason at all, it's been revealed had a purpose of getting into it, I would be freaking out. I would be meeting up, at the Capitol, picketing, growing my hair out, completely trying to be counterculture of the people in my country that felt like that was your responsibility. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, at least in that culture, drugs were involved with that. Things that probably, I don't think, helped that movement. It's tough, because I wasn't alive back then, It's tough to have a perspective on history through one little lens.
And did your parents sometimes say anything about like civil rights movement or something like that?
No, not at all. My parents grew up in even smaller towns than me. I grew up in a town of about 1,500 people. My parents grew up in towns of about 300 people. And they were in that gap of, they were too young to be a part of the hippie movement. And they were really in that gap of, after the Vietnam War and really things just starting to settle down. And those countercultures being able to exist in itself, There was like the culture, at the time it was like the norm, it felt like. It seems like, at least if you look back in time, there was the culture of the norm, and then there was the counterculture, which was the hippie movement, civil rights movement, Black Panthers, and all that. And after all that dust settled, it seemed like those cultures were able to exist and coexist. And then little other pods of culture came out, and hip hop came out, and grunge culture and all this, Seemed like after that, in the States, the ability to recreate culture and to plant new forms of culture was okay, and less frowned upon maybe than I don't know, the hippie movement. I don't know. I speak on it like a historian, and I really don't want to come off like that because I don't know the history of it like a historian would.